The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the very first day of this very first session in this new decade, 2020, here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'll share something shortly, but before that I want to preface it with this. When I was born, it was before there was any electronic media. We had wind-up record players. Eventually we had the Victrolas, the electric record players, and then eventually after that, by the time I was in high school, there were long playing records, LP records, and it was still some time to come before there was anything else. Having spent my earlier childhood in Canada, there was no television in Canada. It hadn't arrived yet. In the 1950s, when we moved down from Canada back to the United States, and my brother and I were stashed with our grandparents in Ohio while my parents built a house in Cleveland Heights. And my grandfather had one of the first TVs, one of the first big console TVs. However, there wasn't even programming for 12 hours, much less 24 hours of the day, and it was all black and white. And there were a couple of kids' programs, Howdy Doody, Hopalong Cassidy, The Lone Ranger in the evening. There must have been news as well, though I don't recall anybody watching it. And on occasion there'd be maybe a ballet or something in the afternoon briefly. But that was about it as far as programming. It was a long time coming till people began to be able to have personal computers. And once that happened, things really took off. We ended up eventually having cell phones. We had social media began, and people began to live their lives through their electronics. And this has really impacted Western society, I think society in general, because even in Asia it's endemic. Kids going to school, coming back from school, as soon as they would get on the train, they'd whip out their cell phones and immediately start texting each other. And this was a long time before they did that in the United States. They also could just flash their cell phones at the turnstiles for the train stations and the subway stations and so on, and that would automatically log them on. How it was paid for, I don't know, but probably the same way it's done these days when we have some similar activities in the United States that allow us to just swipe our telephone and it pays for whatever we're getting. We can swipe it to show our boarding pass in the airport to get on an airplane. And there are various other places where we can use it, although not anywhere near as endemic as in Japan 20 years ago. What this has done to society is major. And what it has done to the ability of human beings to develop social interactions, positive, effective social interactions, is also pretty major. Psychologists are quite concerned about a number of things in this direction, one of which is the fact that when the parents are tuned into their phones at the expense of being there for their kids, and we can walk down the street or be in an office, waiting room, or anywhere else and see this in action, the kids are not developing in the way, in the human way the kids are meant to develop, that human beings are meant to develop. I was in a waiting room a few years ago, and there was a couple with their young kid who was probably about 6 years old. And he was desperate for the attention of his parents, both of whom were fully engaged in their cell phones. They were not even engaged in each other, they were engaged in their cell phones. And the kid tried any number of different ways to interact with his parents one-on-one, and each time he was met with rebuff. He went over to the corner, got himself a drink of water, and immediately got chastised for that. Nobody, said anything to him other than negative remarks about his behavior. That child, I shudder to think of how he is going to feel about himself when he grows up and how social he's going to be able to be. He's not getting any training, he's not learning any skills in interacting with other human beings. It's possible to live your entire life these days attached to a cell phone or a computer and never see another human being except on a screen. Well, initially, we're raised by parents to some level, but even toddlers have got screens in front of them as soon as they can sit up, and even before that. And often it's mom or dad doing something with the cell phone, and the kid is in their lap watching it. Maybe entertained by it, maybe not, but obviously entranced by this flashing screen. There's an endemic of depression in the United States these days, and I suspect a strong amount of it comes from the fact of people not having other human beings to interact with, to share with, to laugh with. We laugh at the cat videos on the tube. We laugh at the antics of various different animals on the screen. We have a lot of ways of finding humor in things artificially. But in terms of human interaction, it's a sad state of affairs in the world, and it is impacting our culture in a pretty major way. And one of the ways it's impacting the culture, in my view, is to make people far less human, if you want to call it that, less invested in interpersonal interactions and the joy that can come from that, and using dysfunctional means to get attention, not learning how to mitigate difficult emotions, which we do learn as we're growing up if we've got reasonably healthy parents or a reasonably healthy environment to grow up in. We learn how to deal with our negative emotions rather than simply lashing out. And when we add guns to the mix, there are plenty of examples of people in a flash of anger pulling out a gun and shooting somebody. Our Zen practice is aimed at bringing us into the most free and engaged humanity possible through learning how to work with what comes up by going deeply enough that we can see through it and not be caught by it. Our practice is not about avoidance. It's about 360-degree practice. That is, when things come up, we learn how to surf them, how to embrace them, how to work with them in healthy ways. We also, through our practice, learn to be less invested, I think is the right word, in a mind state or the results of a situation. More able to be okay in a profound sense of the word, no matter what happens. Of course, if things are not positive, we work to make it different. But we don't get so invested in it that we're willing to compromise ourselves to do very dysfunctional things, or even to whip out a gun and shoot somebody because we don't like what they're saying or doing. The world is filled with challenge right now, increasingly so. There are the extreme forest fires in Australia that are threatening to burn up the entire island. There are random acts of violence all over the world. People walking into people's homes and knifing people in a party, or walking into a party and taking a gun and shooting a bunch of people, or walking into a clubhouse or a movie theater or a school and randomly shooting as many people as they can. And still the battles about whether somebody should be able to have a gun anytime they feel like it, regardless of their mental condition, regardless of their history of violence, is still raging along. We have superstorms. It's known now that the tornadoes are much more fierce and powerful than they used to be in ages past. There are all kinds of challenges to human beings these days that were far less so even 2 or 3 decades ago. It appears at the moment that war could be imminent with Iran, and people are concerned in many ways about many things. And yet the world keeps running along on their screens, independent of human interaction. We have developed, as a result of that, a reality that is not real. And that boils down to the self-image as well. There's an excellent book that just recently was published. It's called No Self, No Problem: How Neuropsychology is Catching Up with Buddhism. And it's written by Chris Niebauer, who is a PhD and a university professor. He's a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist. And this is the result of several decades of research and also interaction with human beings and study and teaching. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. It's a very small book. I don't recall what it cost. Of course, I got it online. And he talks about how this false self, this self-image, is developed neurologically. What parts of our brain operate to create an image of our being somebody, to create a reality that is not necessarily true at all. And he talks about a number of things that occurred in the past that led scientists to discover certain aspects of the brain and its function. And one of those aspects is the fact that the left brain, there's a part of the left brain called Broca's area that controls speech. And speech is rather an important player in this development of self-image, it appears. For one thing, it's constantly talking to us within our own heads. It's called thoughts. And as Mitra-roshi used to call them, thoughting occurs probably 24/7. And it is a lot of yada yada. But a couple of things about that. One is that this yada yada makes us feel like we exist. And people who are silent, there are some cultures in the world where silence is admired and enhanced and encouraged. There are others, most of the others, where silence is considered a frightening experience. As Descartes so famously said, I think, therefore I am. And that does seem to fall in line with what neuropsychology is discovering, that thinking creates this self-image through speech and through analysis. It's sort of a mapping of reality or of assumed reality. And this is really why, in our practice, the only effective way to practice is to drop beneath the level of speech. It's a vital aspect of practice. And the Susokan practice, the extended out-breath practice, goes a long way to helping us reach that way of practicing. Speech creates ideas, stories. What is the real truth of the moment? Our stories are colored by our mind states, by what's happening in the moment, what's happened in the past, who we think we are. There's a lot. But what's the reality? This is what we're seeking, because the reality, the true reality, will set us free. We can go around in circles, analyzing, assuming, but that's not the truth. There's a place for that, perhaps in science and in creativity too. I mean, we don't want to get rid of speech. We just want to drop beneath it while we are practicing, and perhaps at other times as well. For example, if we're caught in a situation where our emotions are coming up and we are tempted to act out on those emotions, whether it's to punch somebody in the face or to run away in tears or what, it doesn't matter what it is. But in being in the control of our emotions, we're not seeing things clearly. It's important to see things clearly, to live fully, to live a rich life, to live a compassionate life, to live a functional life. And in order for that to happen, we have to pay attention. And that's the other thing I wanted to speak of today. Centuries ago, a monk asked a master, what is the most important thing in practice? And I think it was in China, and so he happened to be doing some calligraphy, and he picked up his brush, dipped it in the ink, and wrote the character for attention, which in kanji, if I remember correctly, is composed of two characters, one on top of the other. One is the edge of a knife blade. The other is the character for mind. When we are sharp to the moment, that is attention. When we are not distracted by something else, that is attention. At any rate, he wrote the character for attention, and the monk says, what do you mean, attention? And the master wrote it again. And the monk said, really, what does it mean? And the master said, attention means attention. Mindfulness is a big buzzword these days in the West. Mindfulness is on the way to attention. It's kind of hard to be attentive without being mindful. But the degree to which we can attend goes way beyond being mindful. And it's that deep level of attention that is critical in our practice. Each time we draw our mind back, our attention back to the breath, to the extended out breath, over and over and over again, open to whatever might arise, and yet not getting caught in it, but just aware of it, is the major part of the practice. And each time we do that, we are increasing our ability to be aware and attentive, to be mindful. And this also is a critical part of practice. It's an essential part of practice. So as you do your zazen, being fully present in the moment, extending that out breath beyond where you would ordinarily breathe back in, does certain things. I mean, among other things, it quiets the language part of our brain. And that's perhaps part of why it's so effective, because we're not describing the situation to ourselves. We're not creating an artificial story about what we're experiencing. So pay attention. The clearest, most precise, most fully functioning attention you can in each moment. And when the story comes forth, oh, gee whiz, I wasn't really doing that right. Why can't I just follow this breath? Why do I have to keep going into all these places where I forget about it? As the brother of a good friend of mine once said as he stalked out of the zendo and never came back, was, I don't know what I was doing in there, but it wasn't zazen. Well, he was wrong. It was zazen. But what was his idea about what zazen was? Attention, awareness, going beneath the level of thought, of ideas, of voice, of speech. Actually will enhance our ability to use speech, by the way, when we do need to use it. It'll enhance our creativity when we do need to be creative, because we get out of our own way as we do that extended out-breath practice. And part of the out-breath practice is an openness to possibility that lies way beyond speech. What is the true reality? Who am I? This face before my parents were born, what is it? This moo, what is it? This moment, what is it? Dive in, bring your mind back again and again and again and again and again and again and again to this practice, and you will be amazed at what will happen. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.